Okay, today we begin to discuss labor under the Habsburgs, 1800 to 1947 specifically, but right now we'll deal with the history of labor, which is going to span and be extremely brief the history between the 13th century to 1848, which was the Hungarian uprising in the Habsburg Empire. So the Austria-Hungary, um, specifically mainland Austria, labor unions, which we'll see come to form the democratic process in Europe, and the name used for socialism um, was partially intended to entail a democratic revolution, and did so through non-government agency and association called labor unions that sought the welfare and political organization of the lowest class of individuals in Europe. Um, so they weren't all artisans. Many of them were industrial, lower class peoples. But the artisans in the 19th century and the Habsburg Empire were also inordinately more. They were extremely similar in their mannerisms and their forms of work, very similar to the medieval period artisans. Not much had industrialized insofar as the small artisans went. So small artisans would take on up to 9 apprentices, and during these times we'll see that we'll see that the industrial laborers joined in on the artisans' guilds, which had existed for many centuries and tried to been disbanded and been involved in political upheaval. And then the other class of laborers would be the peasants, agricultural laborers. But this is distinct, apparently, from the situation in England, where the industrial workers that led the labor unions, the labor union revolutions, which were in and of themselves meant to be democratic revolutions, as in freedom of association of workers campaigning for their own rights in non-government organizations. But it so commingles with government organizations because they did lead to political parties. Those were industrialists, not artisans. But um, there is a relationship between the guilds workers in Austria and these labor parties. All right, and so it's around the turn of the 20th century that what we now call trade unions really see their modern form. Three categories, not too difficult to understand, of authorities that laborers conflicted with: the civil authorities, the military authorities, and the religious authorities. The Habsburg Empire is largely a descendant of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. It excludes South Italy. It maintains North Italy. It maintains large parts of Germany. The German states at the time we'll be talking about aren't as a unified kingdom. In fact, it's the 19th century that saw the rise of young Germany and a national identity in Germany, and saw Germany enter the world stage as a superpower. Um, that happened in the 19th century. And it's also true for Italy, though it's not often discussed. It's also true for it's true for Italy that they don't have this national identity, other than they don't have a democratic national identity, and that's kind of the theme of what I want to talk about, is that Europe doesn't have a democratic identity the way that it's assumed in U.S. American politics. That that democracy is something that is something that's taken for granted in Europe. It's not. Um, there are monarchies that exist up until the mid 20th century in Europe. The advancement of rights of the common people is um, appallingly uh, non-existent, and something that's often not discussed. But furthermore, what I want to say is that the 20th century is also the rise of nationalism in these states, where states really form a national identity. What happened with Germany in the 19th century, which led to World War One, is it became a superpower and a unified national identity, a culturally unified, um, and became a beacon of what we could call democracy, but what at that time the people would refer to as socialism. Utopianism, yeah. And print. A lot of we'll see how much of Austria's politics is influenced by print produced in Germany. So Berlin was a really important place in that time. And yeah, 19th century saw the rise of Germany as a superpower. So back to Austria. 1278, one of the first Habsburg emperors, Rudolf, dissolved the Vienna artisan guilds. Again, those are actual trade artisans. These aren't, I mean, they're hard laborers, but these are certainly not peasants, and they're not. There's a distinction between what we're going to be talking about in labor unions and the artisans, but they commingle in this empire, which is different from how things happen in England. Tyrol, Salzburg, Carinthia, and Styria were all mining cities for coal and iron, and saw armed peasantry rise um, during the 300 years from 1278. So the dissolution of artisan guilds that was decreed by the emperor really didn't hold, and there was association occurring, armed association, and armies being built in these coal and iron towns, who helped fight the peasants alongside the peasants in 1525. Conflicts between 1625 and 1755. So in the 18th century, we see quite a few public demonstrations against laborers and revolts, violent revolts of laborers. Kind of came to a head, um, and maybe settled in the beginning of the 19th century, preceding the 1848 revolution, which was the Hungarian Uprising Revolution. Because all these nationalist identities exist in Austria, which was the main problem of the time during Franz Joseph's reign, which began in the early 19th century and ended in the early 20th century, was nationalist uprisings. But labor labor is taken for granted in those conversations. But it's important to understand the cultural reality of what happened in Europe in the 20th century. So the context is important. During this time, beginning 19th century, factory funds, so-called, were developed, which were similar to the process that unions would utilize to take care of their union members. This originated in Bohemia. Excuse me. Switched up here. Hold on, I guess that's it. So now we can get a bit of context on some Wikipedia pages, looking up the peasantry in this time period. Or not necessarily in this time period, but this is meant to be in it, leading up to the period we'll talk about mostly, which is 19th century socialism and communism. Again, probably just a poor word for workers' democracy, non-government unions, organizations, associations. But right now we'll just go over the peasant wars preceding the 19th century. In Germany, so this is a split kingdom, obviously at this time. Well, at the time we're speaking of. The German Peasants' War was the largest uprising of the lower class in Europe preceding the French Revolution. You can see here 100,000 to 300,000 slaughtered. So what's often found with peasant revolutions is some kind of commingling between attempted religious revolution. This would be an outlying factor in the Gutenberg Revolution, one would think, but it's often not discussed, that the consumption of literature mobilized peasants. Whether or not that's true, what's more important is understanding that these religious ideas that often commingled with peasant uprisings in Western Europe, say Germany, France, Switzerland, and Austria. If they're anything common with the French ideals, perhaps they're not. It's not ideas that mobilize these uprisings. It's conditions in the case of peasantry and actually oppressed lower class hard laborers, maybe boredom and resentment in the case of cities people, for instance, in the French Revolution. So the peasantry in Upper Austria did come to a head in 1626. But interestingly, we find that peasantry is excluded from this historical discussion of labor unions, which we can try to remedy. Now we'll go on to a contextual video about the Austro-Hungarian Empire.